There have been clearly quite significant changes in global order. They're underway right now. But before turning to them, I'd like to say just a word about the fact that they may not continue for very long. There's an unfortunate reason. The reason you all know, I'm sure, is that for the first time in human history, we are facing realistic questions of species survival, at least in any decent form. That concern is not new, but unfortunately nothing much has been done about it. Over half a century ago, in July 1955, two of the greatest figures of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, issued an extraordinary appeal to the people of the world to face a choice that, in their words, is stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? Russell and Einstein were, of course, thinking of nuclear war. There have been many very close calls since. It's kind of a miracle that the species has survived this far. And they continue. In fact, even in recent weeks. If there's time, I may say something about them. And there's a companion threat, which they didn't realize at the time, but it's now understood. That's environmental disaster. It's meeting in Bonn right now that almost certainly will have no outcome that is supposed to deal with it. The threat of environmental disaster was highlighted by a report last week from the International Energy Agency. The report was that greenhouse gas emissions had increased by a record amount last year, despite the recession, and that the chances are now quite slim for holding global warming to a 2-degree Celsius level. That's considered to be the threshold for really dangerous climate change, and we may have passed it. I'll return briefly to both of these matters, merely noting that they cast a dark shadow over any discussion of global order. Well, let's put those grim prospects to the side and consider the evolving global order. One major theme widely discussed is what's called American decline. It's real, but I think it's sometimes misinterpreted. It's commonly described as another stage in a long-term shift of global hegemony from east to west, crossing the Atlantic and now moving across the Pacific to the rising powers, China and India. And their recent growth is indeed spectacular, but I think this is an error of interpretation. And though there is a significant global shift, I think it may be different than this one. Well, proceeding to approach that, let's look back briefly to the evolution of the contemporary global order, beginning with World War II, when it made a huge change. The changes and continuities since that time are significant. They're very real, and they're quite instructive. It's worth thinking about them. From the outset of the war in 1939, Washington anticipated that the war would end with the United States in a position of overwhelming power. There were high-level meetings right through the war, 1939 to 1945, high-level government officials and non-governmental foreign policy specialists. They met to lay out plans for the post-war world. They delineated what they called a grand area that the U.S. was going to dominate. And it included the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire Far East, and the former British Empire, which the U.S. would take over, including, crucially, its Middle East energy reserves. As Russia began to grind down the Nazi armies after Stalingrad, grand area planning changed. The goals expanded to include as much of Eurasia as possible, at least its economic core in Western Europe. And within the grand area, there were certain policies which still hold. I simply read them. Within the grand area, the United States would maintain unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy, and it would ensure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its global designs. These are doctrines that still prevail, though the ability to impose them has declined. It's very clear from the documentary record that President Roosevelt was aiming at United States hegemony in the post-war world. I'm quoting the accurate assessment by one of the leading diplomatic historians, the British historian Geoffrey Warner, one of the major specialists on the topic. And much more significant, the careful wartime plans were very soon implemented thoughtfully and in great detail. And it's not surprising that the U.S. had those plans. At that time, the United States was in a position of historically unprecedented power. It had literally 50% of the world's wealth, had incomparable security. It controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, it controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. State Department planning, which was largely in the hands of George Kennan, the head of the State Department planning staff, it assigned to each region of the world what they called its function. In Latin America, the function was to fulfill the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The doctrine announced that the U.S. would dominate the hemisphere, but couldn't be implemented at the time. The British were much too powerful. But after the Second World War, you could implement the Monroe Doctrine. That was our little region over here, as the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, explained, while demanding that all regional alliances be dismantled except for our own, which would be expanded. The function of Southeast Asia was to provide resources and raw materials to the former colonial masters. The United States had little interest in Africa at the time, so Kennan assigned Africa to Europe to exploit, it's his word, for Europe to exploit for its reconstruction. You could imagine a different relation between Europe and Africa in the light of history, but that wasn't considered. As for Europe itself, it was to be reconstituted, but in a very specific way. It was to be reconstituted only after labor and the left were suppressed. That's the core of the anti-fascist resistance, of course. They had to be suppressed, and the traditional order had to be reestablished, including fascist collaborators. That sometimes required considerable violence, and large-scale subversion continued for many years. In Italy, it continued well into the 1970s. For Germany, it was necessary, I'm quoting, to veto the major union constitutions, to forcefully terminate social experiments, to bar early co-determination efforts, and more generally to wall off the Western zone from the East. That was Kennan's interesting phrase. Planners were concerned that they would not be able to compete with social and economic pressures coming from the East, so therefore Western Germany had to be walled off. That meant left labor influences, and they were very explicit about it. Then later came the Marshall Plan, which doubtless aided European reconstruction, but it had other goals as well. In reality, the Marshall Plan, if you look at what happened, it was very largely a taxpayer subsidy, U.S. taxpayer subsidy to U.S. businesses. Most of the money never left the United States. And that's appreciated by the beneficiaries in the United States, the domestic beneficiaries. So Ronald Reagan's Commerce Department pointed out that, in their words, the Marshall Plan set the stage for large amounts of private U.S. direct investment in Europe, laying the groundwork for the rise of multinational corporations, at that time almost all American. Business Week, the main business journal, described multinational corporations as the economic expression of the political framework established by post-war policymakers, in which American business prospered and expanded on overseas orders, fueled initially by the dollars of the Marshall Plan and protected from negative developments by the umbrella of American power. That's 1975. It was always recognized that Europe might choose to follow an independent course, perhaps along Gaullist lines. And NATO was partially intended to counter that threat. And that was seen very clearly in 1989, 1990, when the official pretext for NATO dissolved. Official pretext, NATO's there to protect Western Europe from the Russian hordes. No more Russian hordes. Anyone who believed the propaganda of the preceding years should have expected that NATO would dissolve. On the contrary, it was expanded to the east in violation of very explicit pledges, but only verbal pledges to Gorbachev, who was pretty upset when they were violated, but Washington pointed out to him that the pledges weren't on paper, and if he was stupid enough to accept a gentleman's agreement, that's his problem. So in violation of the pledges, expanded to the east, and since then it's been expanded well beyond. It's now officially a U.S.-run global intervention force. Its official task is controlling the crucial infrastructure of the global energy system, pipelines, sea lanes, and so on. Nevertheless, what's called American declinism set in very quickly. The Grand Area began to unravel very seriously by 1947 with what's called the loss of China, which is an interesting term. It's the term constantly used. Debates about who's responsible for the loss of China. And the phrase is worth thinking about. You can only lose what you possess. And legitimate ownership of the world is just taken for granted. It's not surprisingly, given the scale of U.S. power. Southeast Asia began to go the same way, first in Indochina, but much more seriously in Indonesia, much more valuable prize. In 1958, President Eisenhower carried out the largest intervention since World War II. The goal was to support a military revolt, overthrowing the government. The idea was to split off the outer islands. That's where most of the rich resources are. That failed, but in 1965, there was a U.S.-backed military coup in Indonesia, which installed the dictatorship of General Suharto. It carried it out with a staggering bloodbath that was a gleam of light in Asia, in the words of the New York Times. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered, mostly landless peasants, and the country was thrown open to Western exploitation. Euphoria in the West was virtually unconstrained. Years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, he reflected in retrospect that the United States should probably have called off the Vietnam War in 1965, since the major objective had been achieved. The major objective, we know from declassified documents, was to prevent what's called the virus of independent nationalism from spreading contagion to the rest of the region, possibly even Japan. It's called the super domino by the eminent Asia historian John Dower. The fear of contagion from the virus of independent nationalism, that's the terminology later of Henry Kissinger, Nixon administration. Now, that's a leading theme of post-war history, one of the major themes, in fact. Well, our little region over here, Latin America, that posed similar dangers early on. In 1954, the United States overthrew the first democratic government in Guatemala, installed a brutal dictatorship that carried out horrendous crimes, ultimately a virtual genocide of the Mayans and the highlands, still fleeing to the United States, all with the strong support of the Reagan administration. But the contagion nevertheless spread. In 1962, President Kennedy shifted the mission of the Latin American military, which of course the United States can do. It shifted the mission from hemispheric defense, which was a kind of a holdover from World War II, to internal security. Internal security has a very definite meaning. It means war against the population, brutal war. And the consequences are described by Charles Maechling. He's the man who led counterinsurgency and internal defense planning in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He described Kennedy's 1962 decision, I'll quote him, as a shift from toleration of the rapacity and cruelty of the Latin American military to direct complicity in their crimes, to U.S. support for the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. Just recently, Cambridge University Press published Academic History of the Cold War, Latin American. One of the contributions is by Latin American scholar John Coatsworth, and he writes that from that time, the early 60s, to the Soviet collapse in 1990, quoting, the numbers of political prisoners, torture victims, executions of nonviolent political dissenters in Latin America vastly exceeded those of the Soviet Union and its East European satellites, all supported, sometimes instituted by Washington. That included a long series of religious martyrs and mass slaughter as well. The last major violent act was a week after the Berlin Wall fell, a brutal assassination of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests. The perpetrators were an elite Salvadoran battalion, which already had left a trail of thousands of brutally murdered victims. They had just come from renewed training at the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare, and they were acting on direct, we now know, on direct orders of the high command of the U.S. client state, which was in always close contact with Washington. Well, the consequences of this hemispheric plague still, of course, reverberate. From the wartime years, in fact, since the dawn of the oil age, back during the First World War, control of the Middle East was regarded as a very high priority. In President Eisenhower's judgment, the Middle East was the most strategically important area of the world. It was a stupendous source of strategic power, probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment. That's the judgment of the State Department in the 1940s. And that was a prize that the United States intended to keep for itself and its allies in the unfolding New World Order of that day. Well, problems also arose there very early in the oil-producing regions. In 1953, the United States and Britain overthrew the parliamentary regime of Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran, installed the dictatorship of the Shah. And the general reaction of liberal intellectual elites was expressed very clearly by the New York Times editors. Quote, "Underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism. It's too much to hope that Iran's experience will prevent the rise of Mossadeghs in other countries, but that experience may at least strengthen the hands of more reasonable and more far-seeing leaders who will have a clear-eyed understanding of the principles of decent behavior." Decent behavior means you follow U.S. orders and you don't try to take over your own resources. That's the liberal, progressive end of the spectrum. Go to the right, it gets harsher. Consequences of that are too well known to review. Well, that's the merest sketch of implementation of grand area policies in what's called the Global South. The preferred version of the post-war era is quite different. It's actually expressed quite well by the lead article in the current issue of Britain's prime foreign policy journal, International Affairs. It discusses, I'll quote it, the visionary international order of the second half of the 20th century, marked by the universalization of an American vision of commercial prosperity. Well, there's something to that account, but it does not quite convey the perception of those who are at the wrong end of the guns. And that's typical of Western ideological pronouncements called scholarship and journalism and so on. Grand area doctrine restricts the sovereignty of others, but it grants the United States unrestricted rights. Among these is the right to carry out unilateral military intervention at will. And that doctrine has repeatedly been articulated, for example, by the Clinton administration. It explained that the U.S. has the right to use military force unilaterally to ensure, I'm quoting, uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, and the U.S. must maintain military forces forward deployed in Europe and Asia in order to shape people's opinions about us, not by handing out chocolate bars, and to shape events that will affect our livelihood and our security. Notice that the Clinton doctrine was considerably more extreme than the Bush doctrine. The Bush doctrine received a lot of criticism, but more because of the style and the content. Clinton presented it politely, pleasant words, and so on. The Bush administration presented it with extreme arrogance, and European leaders don't like to be insulted. They don't mind the doctrine. In fact, they accept it, but present it to us politely, please. The same principles govern the invasion of Iraq. After a few years, it was becoming quite clear that the United States was unable to impose its will in Iraq. And at that point, the actual goals of the invasion couldn't be concealed any longer behind the usual pretty rhetoric. In November 2007, the White House issued what they called a Declaration of Principles, which insisted that U.S. forces must remain indefinitely in Iraq, free to carry out combat operations, and that Iraq must privilege American investors. 2 months later, January 2008, President Bush informed Congress that he would reject legislation that might limit the permanent stationing of U.S. armed forces in Iraq or U.S. control of the oil resources of Iraq. Very explicit. All of this, of course, had been concealed before, nice rhetoric about democracy, the usual. These were demands that the United States had to abandon in the face of Iraqi resistance. That was another step in a major defeat. It's quite unlike Vietnam, where the U.S. did achieve its major aims, that, as was recognized by McGeorge Bundy, for example. Well, throughout these years, despite many successes, American declinism continued. By 1970, the U.S. share of global wealth had declined to about 25%, still enormous, but much less than the post-war height of 50%. The other industrial powers had recovered with considerable assistance from U.S. violence. So the Korean War was a major stimulus to Japan's recovery, and the Vietnam War gave it another significant boost. It also helped to spark South Korea's remarkable development from the level of a poor African state to a leading industrial power. A substantial share of South Korea's foreign exchange in the 1960s came from mercenaries. Vicious, brutal mercenaries that they were providing for the American war in Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of them. Decolonization was proceeding, following its agonizing course. By 1970, the industrial world was described as tripolar, three: North America, Western Europe, and East Asia. At that time, Japan-based and already beginning to become the most dynamic industrial region of the world. Well, one revealing index of the decline of U.S. power is vetoes at the United Nations. Until 1965, there were none. The world was under control, and the UN, in fact, could be used as a weapon against the Soviet Union. Since 1965, the United States is far in the lead in vetoes on a very wide range of issues. Britain is second, and no one else is even close. In the 1970s, there were also quite radical changes in the entire state capitalist system, with the twin processes of financialization of the economy, and for the U.S., the offshoring of production. These effects have been substantial, and they've contributed to a self-inflicted acceleration of American decline. I'll return to that. Decline has continued in the new millennium. Very dramatic developments have taken place in our little region over here in the past decade. For the first time in 500 years, since the days of the European conquerors, the countries of South America have begun to deal with their terrible internal problems, ruled by a small, Europeanized, often white elite with enormous wealth. These are just little islands in a sea of miserable poverty. They've begun to deal with it. And they've also begun to move towards integration. That's a prerequisite for independence. The U.S. has been expelled from all of its military bases in South America. One symbol of the current developments is the formation of an organization, CELAC, which includes all states of the Western Hemisphere apart from the U.S. and Canada. That would have been unthinkable before. Its first meeting is scheduled in a few weeks, and if it becomes operational, that'll be another step in undoing the Monroe Doctrine. Well, control of Latin America was always considered a cornerstone of global dominance. One dramatic moment was under the Nixon administration, when it was preparing for the overthrow of Chilean democracy. The National Security Council, top planning board, observed that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world, that is, to control the rest of the world. Washington's credibility would be undermined, as Henry Kissinger put it. He was planning the overthrow of the democratic government. The concern, as Kissinger explained, was that others too might separate themselves from U.S. control if the Chilean virus was not destroyed before it could spread contagion, his phrase. He was actually concerned with Southern Europe. He thought that was the period of what was called Eurocommunism, kind of social democratic movements in Spain and Italy. And Kissinger was concerned that the Chilean virus might spread contagion there. He didn't expect the Chilean army to land in Rome, but he was afraid that the model might inspire others. Actually, Brezhnev shared that concern at the time for other reasons. Therefore, parliamentary democracy in Chile had to go. That actually happened on what in Latin America is often called the first 9/11, September 11th, 1973. It's gone from history in the West, though in terms of the consequences for Chile and the whole region, it far outweighs the terrible crimes of what we call 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Well, important as Latin America was for world control, it paled alongside the Middle East. I've already mentioned some assessments of its significance at the dawn of the post-war age. Despite all the changes since, there's every reason to suppose that today's policymakers basically adhere to the judgment of very influential Roosevelt advisor, A.A. Burley, who observed that control of the incomparable energy reserves of the Middle East would yield substantial control of the world. And correspondingly, notice that doesn't mean access to the resources. In fact, they didn't much care about that. It's control, very different matter. Correspondingly, the loss of that control would threaten the project of global dominance that was very clearly articulated during World War II and has been sustained in the face of major changes in world order ever since that day. But that's being threatened too. Right now, U.S. dominance in that region is under severe threat. That's the Arab Spring. The Arab world is beginning to move in the same direction as Latin America in the past decade. That's the democratic uprising of the Arab Spring. And the U.S. and its Western allies are sure to do whatever they can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. It's very important to understand. And to understand why, it's sufficient to take a look at the studies of Arab public opinion. These are conducted by the most respected U.S. polling agencies. In the United States, they're not reported at all. They're barely mentioned elsewhere. You can tell me whether they're reported here, but they're certainly known to planners. They reveal that by overwhelming majorities, Arabs regard the United States and Israel as the major threats they face. 90% in Egypt, the most important country in the region. There are some in the Arab world who think of Iran as a threat, 10%. Opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that a majority in the Arab world believe that security would be improved if Iran had nuclear weapons to deter the United States. In Egypt, that's 80% of the population, and other figures are pretty much similar. Well, the conclusion is that if public opinion were to influence policy, as would happen if there's any serious move towards democracy, then the United States would not only not control the region, but it would be expelled from it, along with its allies. That would undermine fundamental principles of global domination. The contempt of elite opinion for democracy was revealed very dramatically in the reaction to the WikiLeaks exposures. The ones that received most attention, euphoric commentary, were cables reporting that Arabs support the U.S. stand on Iran. The reference was to the ruling dictators. The attitudes of the public were unmentioned. So it's enough if the dictators support us. Doesn't matter if the public is radically opposed. And there is a guiding principle that was articulated pretty clearly by the Middle East specialist of the Carnegie Endowment, Marwan Mouasher. He's formerly a high official of the Jordanian dictatorship. The principle is there's nothing wrong, everything's under control. In short, if the dictators support us and they control the population, nothing else can matter. That's the Western conception of democracy, very clearly exhibited. The Watcher Doctrine is rational and very venerable. To mention just one case that's highly relevant today and ought to be taught to everyone in schools in the West. There was internal discussion in 1958, President Eisenhower, and Eisenhower expressed concern about what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by governments, but by the people. And the National Security Council issued a memorandum explaining it. They said that there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports dictatorships and blocks democracy and development, and we do it in order to ensure control over their resources. And furthermore, they said the perception is basically accurate, and that's exactly what we should be doing, relying on the Watcher Doctrine. As long as the dictators can keep the population under control, doesn't matter what they think. If there's a campaign of hatred, who cares? After 9/11, there were, you may recall that George Bush, President, plaintively pleaded that they hate our freedom, echoed by many intellectuals. The government actually carried out a study, and it confirmed that they do not hate our freedom, they hate our policies, and with good reason, namely the ones that the National Security Council described in 1958. The truth of the matter is we hate their freedom, and with very good reason, we being the governments of the West and elite opinion in the West. Well, in Egypt, though the old regime still remains pretty much in place, there have been important victories. The press is far more free. Labor organizing, which was brutally crushed under the Western-backed dictatorships, it now proceeds effectively, and the struggle for democracy is unabated. It's going on constantly. Now poses serious threats to the United States and its Israeli client. For the first time in 30 years, Egypt has allowed Iranian ships to transit the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, which is supposed to be an American lake. Actually, just yesterday, you may have read, it was reported that Iranian submarines were allowed to transit into the Mediterranean. Egypt is also planning to exchange ambassadors with Iran for the first time. Egypt has partially opened the Gaza border. If that proceeds, it breaks the U.S.-Israeli siege, which is designed to keep the people of Gaza at the barest level of survival. Egypt has also brokered an agreement between Hamas and Fatah, two major Palestinian factions, that interferes with U.S.-Israeli policies that go back 20 years to separate Gaza and the West Bank. It's an explicit violation of the Oslo Accords, but the purpose is to undermine the prospects for a viable Palestinian state. Well, there's something more threatening in the background. The Egyptian public is strongly opposed to the way the 1979 Egypt-Israel Treaty has been interpreted by the U.S.-backed dictators. Articulating the Western interpretation of the treaty, the New York Times describes it as a cornerstone of the region's stability. That's true only if we understand the term stability in the technical sense of foreign policy discourse. It means conformity to U.S. demands. That's a standard usage. In reality, it's a cornerstone of the region's instability. It was understood at once that the effect of the Egyptian defection, as it was called, would be to free Israel to sustain military operations against the Palestinian organizations in Lebanon, as well as settlement activity in the West Bank. I'm quoting one of Israel's leading strategic analysts, Avner Yaniv. And it's obvious. You remove the Egyptian deterrent, the only major deterrent in the Arab world, can proceed to do what you like. And in fact, Israel at once prepared to invade Lebanon, as it did in 1982 with strong support from the Reagan administration, killed maybe 20,000 people, destroyed much of the country. It sought to establish a puppet regime, didn't quite succeed, and the purpose was to consolidate control over the West Bank. And that was frankly admitted. There was no security concern. Also settlement in the occupied territories, all illegal, proceeded very rapidly. And the problem is that further progress toward democracy in Egypt might seriously threaten the form of so-called stability that the U.S. seeks to impose. Well, as I mentioned, Arab public opinion strongly supports an Iranian nuclear weapons program, but that doesn't mean that we should do so. It could be extremely dangerous. And if you read the foreign policy literature, or even the press, it's full of proposals as to how to deal with this potential threat. One proposal is studiously ignored, the one that's very strongly favored by most of the world, namely, establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, that issue regularly arises at the regular meetings, the conferences of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference every 5 years. Last one was at the UN headquarters in New York last year. At that point, Egypt was the chair of the 118 nations of the non-aligned movement. It's most of the world. They proposed that the conference call for negotiations on a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. Now, that had been formally agreed by the West, including the United States, at the 1995 review conference, but they didn't do anything about it. Well, international support last year was so overwhelming that the Obama administration formally had to agree, while saying, fine idea, but not now. Furthermore, they insisted that Israel be exempted. And of course, the U.S. is self-exempted from international obligations in quite interesting ways, which are not well understood. Washington informed the conference that no proposal, quoting it now, no proposal can call for Israel's nuclear program to be placed under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and no proposal can call for release of information about Israeli nuclear facilities and activities, including information pertaining to previous nuclear transfers to Israel. Well, so much for a nuclear weapons-free zone. That's one of the many ways in which the threat of nuclear war is being advanced right now. It's worth bearing in mind how isolated the United States and its allies are on Iran. The non-aligned countries, again, most of the world, for years they've been vigorously endorsing Iran's right to pursue uranium enrichment. The Arab world, as I mentioned, even wants them to go on to nuclear weapons. The most important country in the region, Turkey, is improving commercial relations with Iran, a very natural trading partner, and it's announced plans to triple its relations. The most respected country of the global south, Brazil, has also strongly supported Iran's position. That's most of the world. Well, the United States can tolerate Turkish and Brazilian disobedience, though with dismay, but China is harder to ignore. The press warns, I'm quoting the New York Times, that China's investors and traders are now filling a vacuum in Iran as businesses from other countries, especially in Europe, pull out. Europe is obedient to U.S. orders, but China isn't. These sanctions have absolutely no status. Those are unilateral U.S. sanctions. China does observe the UN sanctions, but that's because they're toothless. The issue has to do with the unilateral U.S. sanctions. In particular, China is expanding its dominant role in Iran's energy industry. Well, Washington is very upset, and they're reacting with a touch of desperation. The State Department issued a warning to China that if it wants to be accepted in the international community, that's another technical term like stability. The international community means the United States and anybody who happens to be going along with it at the moment. So if they want to be accepted in the international community, then China must not skirt and evade international responsibilities, which are clear, namely follow U.S. orders. As I said, China does accept the relatively toothless UN sanctions, but it ignores the unilateral U.S. sanctions. It's therefore undermining stability in the technical sense. It's an illegitimate exercise of sovereignty in violation of grand area principles. I need not say that China's quite unimpressed by the stern warning. Their picture is, we've been around for 3,000 years, disregarding the barbarians, and will continue. And that's very disturbing to the United States. Well, the hegemonic doctrines that were formulated during World War II, they still prevail, but the capacity to implement them is declining as the world is becoming more diverse, more independent. But there are also, as I mentioned, there are domestic factors contributing to America's decline. The society is being quite consciously undermined at home by the people who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, those who control the economic system. No time to go into the details, but since the sharp economic shift towards financialization and offshoring of production in the 1970s, a variety of factors have converged to create a vicious cycle of radical concentration of wealth, mostly in the top 1%, 1/10 of 1% actually, of the population. Such a small group, it's not even picked up by census figures. That's where the heavy extreme inequality is coming from. That means CEOs, directors of corporations, hedge fund managers, and so on. Their activities are of little, if any, benefit to the economy. They're probably harmful to it. But that's where the economic power is concentrated. And concentration of economic power translates at once to concentration of political power. It's another point emphasized by that dangerous radical Adam Smith, who we're supposed to worship but not read, too dangerous to read him. He pointed out that in his day, speaking of England, the merchants and manufacturers were the masters of mankind, and they were also the principal architects of policy. They made sure that their own interests were very well served, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England. Well, that was the 1770s, and that principle remains. The concentration of economic and with it political power has led to state policies that are designed to increase the concentration. Fiscal policies, rules of corporate governance, deregulation, a lot more. Meanwhile, the costs of electoral campaigns have skyrocketed. That has a very clear effect. It drives both political parties deeper into the pockets of concentrated capital, increasingly financial capital. And for the Republicans, this is reflexive. The Democrats are not far behind. There's a lot of commentary about the disappearance of moderate Republicans. That's not quite accurate. They're still there. They're now called Democrats. Everything has shifted so far to the right that old-fashioned moderate Republicans are now the leading Democrats. In fact, if Richard Nixon were in Congress now, he'd be caucusing with a half a dozen people on the far left. That's not a joke, incidentally. While wealth and power have narrowly concentrated for most people in the country, the real incomes have stagnated, and they've been getting by with increased work hours, by now far higher than Europe, even Japan, debt, which can only go on for so long, and asset inflation, like the bubble, the housing bubble is the most recent case. And these bubbles are repeatedly destroyed by the financial crises that began to occur in the Reagan years as the regulatory apparatus was dismantled. The effect is that the country is being severely weakened. Well, none of this is problematic for the very wealthy, in particular for the financial institutions. By now, their share of corporate profit rose to an astonishing 40% in 2007, right before the crash that they caused. And the major players benefit from a government insurance policy, which is called too big to fail. And as one commentator quipped, too big to jail. And they can get away with any crimes they like. They can... the result is that with the government insurance policy, they can make and do make very risky transactions, which mean rich rewards, while adhering to a basic market principle that you ignore externalities. In a market system, you make a transaction, you ignore the effect on others, what economists call externalities. In this case, the externality is systemic risk, the risk that if one of your transactions goes bad, the whole system may collapse. Well, the system inevitably crashes. It's happened over and over again since the Reagan years, each time more serious than the last. But that's not a problem, because they can run to the nanny state that they nurture and ask for a taxpayer bailout, and meanwhile they clutch their copies of Hayek and Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand in their hands. And that's been the regular process since the Reagan years. It's each crisis more extreme than the last. For the public, that is. Right now, real unemployment is at the levels of the Great Depression for much of the population, but the main architects of the crisis are bigger and richer than before. That's what happens when you control the state. Goldman Sachs, for example, the biggest criminal, they've just quietly announced $17.5 billion in compensation for last year for executives, with the CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, receiving a $12.5 million bonus, and his base salary was tripled in appreciation for having crashed the economy. And much the same is true among its colleagues. England is pretty much the same. Well, these developments contribute to American decline, but not as often argued to the shift of global power to China and India. The world's becoming more diverse. But despite their rapid economic progress, these two great Asian powers are hardly poised to assume a dominant role in the world. One illustration, you can look it up on the internet, is the United Nations Human Development Index. It kind of measures the health of the society. China now ranks 89th. They're right next to the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, two pretty poor countries. India ranks 115th. It's next to Cape Verde and Timor-Leste, extremely poor countries. Each of these two Asian giants also suffers from extreme inequality, about the same as the U.S. That means that the large majority of the population ranks even lower. The CIA estimates that China's gross domestic product per capita at about 20% of that of the rich countries, Europe, for example. Furthermore, they both have huge internal problems, ecological and human. India is torn apart by major internal wars, China by severe repression and very wide labor unrest, tens of thousands of labor actions every year, according to official figures. Reality is probably greater. China is also facing a severe demographic problem. It did have spectacular recent growth, but that relied very heavily on the availability of a young and productive labor force. That's a non-repeatable historical phenomenon. China scholar Wang Feng observes that favorable demographic dividend is expected very soon to disappear, and in fact to reverse sharply, with significant effects on labor productivity and also on social life. In particular, ability to care for the growing elderly population. The social system that formerly existed has collapsed. Also, there's an effect on the sex selection. There's illegal, but there's a very definite sex selection policy. It has led to a vast excess of males over females in the population under 20, and that could have extremely severe social effects. China is indeed a huge manufacturing center, but it's not like Germany. China is basically an assembly plant. It's an assembly plant for the advanced industrial societies surrounding it, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. They provide the parts and the components and the advanced technology, as incidentally does the United States and other rich countries of the West. Everyone talks about the U.S. trade deficit with China, but when it's properly calculated, as has been done by a couple of economists, namely estimated in terms of value added, how much is produced, literally produced in each country. Well, it turns out that the deficit with China declines by about 25%, and the deficit with its Asian suppliers increases by about 25%. So this is not the kind of export economy that Germany is, quite different. Sooner or later, China will presumably climb the technology ladder, but it's not going to be an easy path. There is, in fact, a very noticeable and significant global shift of power, but a different one. Not from the West to the Asian giants, but from the global workforce all around the world to the very rich. That's happening everywhere. The tendency is implicit in what are called free trade agreements, which have little to do with free trade and certainly aren't agreements, at least if people are part of their countries. They're mostly opposed. But what are called free trade agreements, they're designed to set working people in competition with one another globally, while protecting wealthy professionals and providing investors with extraordinary rights. Among other benefits for investors, these agreements allow free movement of capital, but they firmly reject Adam Smith's principle that free circulation of labor is a foundation of free trade. And in many other ways, too, they violate basic free trade principles. And these tendencies are exacerbated in very ugly ways by growing xenophobia in the rich societies, notably in Europe. The picture that's developing is very aptly described in a brochure for investors that was produced recently by Citigroup. It's a huge bank that once again is feeding at the public trough, as it has done regularly for 30 years in the course of a cycle of risky loans, huge profits, and bailout when it crashes. And like Goldman Sachs, they've gained from the crisis that they helped create. The bank's analysts in this brochure, they describe a world that's dividing into two blocks. The one block they call the plutonomy. That's the very rich globally. And they're the ones who power the growth, and they're the ones who largely consume the growth. Then there are the non-rich, the majority. Now, those are now sometimes called the global precariat. Precariat is a workforce, a proletariat, living in a precarious existence. That's increasing status of the global workforce. In the United States, the precariat is subject to global worker insecurity. That's Alan Greenspan's words when he was testifying to Congress about the success of the economy he was managing. He said it's based on growing worker insecurity, which is the basis for a healthy economy. Any economist can explain. If workers are insecure, they don't ask for rights, they don't ask for wages, they don't make any protests, you can harshly exploit them. The Citigroup analysts advise investors to focus on the very rich, where the action is. They have what they call a plutonomy stock basket, investment advice aimed at the very rich. And they point out that that plutonomy stock basket has greatly outperformed the World Index of Developed Markets since 1985. That's when Reagan, Thatcher economic programs of enriching the very wealthy were really taking off. Well, that's a shift of power, and a very significant one. I've barely skimmed the surface of these critical issues, enough, I hope, to suggest things you can think about. But I don't want to end without mentioning another externality that's dismissed in market systems. That's the fate of the species. If you're a corporate executive, your task is to maximize short-term profit and market share. That's in fact what your salary is based on. If that happens to endanger the species, that's an externality. You don't pay for it. You don't take account of it in a market system. In the financial system, systemic risk, main externality, that can be remedied by the taxpayer. But nobody's going to come to the rescue if the environment is destroyed. And that it must be destroyed comes pretty close to being an institutional imperative. So U.S. business leaders, U.S. is the most business-run society in the world, so significant in this respect. U.S. business leaders are quite openly conducting energetic propaganda campaigns to convince the population that anthropogenic global warming, human contribution to global warming, is just a hoax. And they're having some success. By now, probably 2/3 of the population doesn't believe it. These same people who are running the campaigns, they're just like the rest of us. They understand very well that the threat is grave. I mean, in their private lives, maybe they're contributing to, Sierra Club or something. But in their institutional lives, they have a role. They have to maximize short-term profit and market share. If they don't do it, they'll be thrown out, and somebody else will come in who will do it, meaning the problem is institutional. It's not individual, hence it's much more severe. Now this is another vicious cycle, and this one could well turn out to be lethal. If you want to get a sense of how grave the danger is, simply have a look at the new Congress in the United States, which is propelled into power by business funding and propaganda. Almost all of the new people in Congress are climate deniers, climate change deniers. They don't believe it. And they've already begun to cut measures that might mitigate environmental catastrophe. So, for example, they're trying to get rid of the Environmental Protection Agency, introduced by Nixon, the last liberal president, and now they want to get rid of it, and much else. Worse still, some of them are really true believers. For example, the new head of a subcommittee on the environment, he explained to the press that global warming cannot be a problem because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. So it takes care of that. Well, actually, one shouldn't laugh. I mean, if this was happening in some small, remote country, okay, then you could laugh. But not when it's happening in the richest and most powerful country in world history. And before we laugh, we might also bear in mind that the current financial and economic crisis is traceable in no small measure to a fanatic faith in certain dogmas, such as what's called the efficient market hypothesis, and in general to what Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz 15 years ago called the religion, and it is a religion, that markets know best. The religion made it unnecessary for economists, and in fact the Federal Reserve, the central bank, made it unnecessary for them to notice that there was an $8 trillion housing bubble. It's a lot of money. $8 trillion housing bubble, no economic fundamentals, no relation to anything in the economy. But they didn't have to notice it because the market knows best. Efficient markets devastated the economy when it burst. That's a serious religion. And incidentally, that religion has been reconstituted almost without change after the total collapse of this edifice, this intellectual edifice. It's a remarkable event in economic history, in fact, in intellectual history. It's useful to think about what's being done in the richest country, the richest, most powerful country in human history, and what's going on in the poorest country of South America. In the United States, Congress is taking the lead, and the Obama administration is going along in undermining any hope for preventing catastrophe. And as I mentioned, it's driven by deeply rooted institutional factors. Poorest country in South America is Bolivia. They have taken the lead in the world in efforts to protect the environment. Their most recent effort is to pass legislation granting rights to the natural world. Well, sophisticated Westerners ridicule such naivete, but unless we gain some of the sensibility of the indigenous majority in Bolivia, the last laugh's going to be on us. Well, all of this and a great deal more can proceed as long as the Watcher Doctrine prevails, as long as the general population is passive, apathetic, diverted to consumerism, hatred of the vulnerable. As long as that goes on, the powerful can do what they please. Masters of the universal have their will, and those who manage to survive can contemplate the ruins. Thanks.
I would like to quote you in an article on capitalism, Europe, and the World Bank about a court case that urged corporations to carry out benevolent activities, or else an aroused public may figure out what corporations are up to and take away their privileges. Now, given that how you on different occasions quoted John Dewey, government is the shadow cast by business over society, does court cases like Dodge versus Ford affect the behavior of politicians?
Does what?
Court cases like Dodge versus Ford.
Yeah.
The behavior of politicians, and if yes, which methods are at the disposal of small and regional operating initiatives to make politicians aware of the existence of an aroused public sex?
Well, business can't ignore I quote John Dewey, but I also quote Adam Smith, who said the same thing, and many others. Business can't ignore what the population is doing. Actually, that's true of totalitarian states as well. So, for example, the Nazi leadership could not ignore public opinion. If you look back, they provided benefits to the public to try to keep them quiet. And the same is true in every totalitarian state. And certainly in more free and democratic societies, that's true. And you can see it happening. So let's go back to the Great Depression. There was President Roosevelt, who was unlike the current leadership. He was fairly sympathetic to social democratic measures, but at one point he told labor leaders who were pressing for him to do various things, he basically told them, "You make me do it." What he meant is get out in the streets, protest in the factories, carry out sit-down strikes, organize, and if there's enough public pressure, I'll do it. But I've got to face down corporate power. Well, that's basically the right advice, and that's exactly what happened. The Great Depression is an interesting case. It began in 1929, but the New Deal measures actually began about 6 years later. It took a while. And by that time, there was massive public protest. That was the period of great labor organizing. The CIO, the Great Industrial Union, was being organized, and they were moving on to sit-down strikes. The sit-down strikes are extremely frightening to the masters of mankind, because a sit-down strike is just one step before saying, we don't need the bosses, we'll run the place ourselves. Okay, at that point you get major concerns. Actually, those are the concerns that in the early post-war period animated US and British planners in places like Germany. They were concerned that that was going to happen under pressure, this pressure from the East that they were worried about. It's one of the reasons they wanted to wall off Western Germany, and the same elsewhere. So these are constant concerns, and it runs from factories to protests in the streets. So, for example, and it has effects. During the 1960s, in the United States, the next major period of social democratic activism on the part of the government, that was clearly motivated by the mostly youth at that time activism in which you know about, the radical activism of the 60s. And in fact, the business world was very upset about it. And the liberal intellectuals were very upset about it. If you haven't read it, there's an important book to read. It's called The Crisis of Democracy, published by the Trilateral Commission in around mid-70s. The Trilateral Commission is liberal internationalists from Europe, the United States, and Japan, three major industrial countries, to give a sense of their complexion. They're the people who staffed the Carter administration. That's kind of the liberal extreme. You go over to the right, it's much harsher. So what was the crisis of democracy that they were concerned about? They were concerned that the population was demanding too much democracy. People who are usually passive and apathetic, what they call the special interests, are getting out in the streets, protesting, insisting on their demands. So who are the special interests? The young, the old, women, workers, farmers. In fact, the population are the special interests. If you notice, you read the book, you'll find there's one interest that they don't mention, corporate power. And there's a reason for that, because they're the national interest by definition. So they can never ask for too much. They're supposed to get everything. But the rest of the population, which is supposed to obey the Watcher Doctrine, supposed to be passive, apathetic, diverted to something else, they were getting out and demanding things. And there were changes. And in fact, these changes ran primarily in the Johnson administration, but also in the Nixon administration. He, as I mentioned, was the last liberal kind of social democratic president. Well, that's from the pressures. And that happens over and over, all the time. That's just a continuing aspect of modern history. So there's a lot you can do. In fact, almost anything in a free societies like ours. There's very few limits. Maybe it might be hard, you might lose a job or something, but you're not going to be tossed into a torture chamber. It's not like the global south or totalitarian states. So sure, everything's open. Exactly what to do depends on the circumstances and the issue. A lot of it's going on right now in say, Spain, with very significant protests underway. It went on in the United States in the industrial heartland, Wisconsin, right at the same time as the Arab Spring. Also very significant. If that reaches enough of a scale, the people who run the place have to pay attention. In fact, if you read the business literature after the 1930s New Deal measures, they were terrified. The business literature talks about the hazard facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses. I'm quoting, the need to fight the everlasting battle for the mind of men, to indoctrinate people with a capitalist story, or else we'll be in trouble. If this sounds like a little red book, it's because it is. The business classes are vulgar Marxists, and they're always fighting a bitter class war, and values happen to be inverted, but it's just what you read in Maoist tracts or something like that. So they understand, constantly at it, and if the population gets out of control, you have to do things. Plenty of examples. In fact, modern history is full of them. That's why we have more freedom and more rights and so on. It's not given as gifts from above.
Ja, fangen wir da an. Ich habe Sie gesehen.
As I understood you, it's upon us as citizens to change the system. Do you think the democracy as we have it at the moment is enough for that, or do we need forms of direct democracy or new forms of democracy?
I mean, in principle, we've got institutions that could work, but you have to make them work. It's like Roosevelt said, make me do it. And there are big barriers to democracy. So, for example, there's a fundamental contradiction between capitalism and democracy. You can't overcome that contradiction. So it's... capitalist system has changed over the years, but it's still divided between people who give orders and people who take them. And as long as that goes on, well, that's plainly a barrier to democracy. If the masters of mankind, Adam Smith's phrase, if they get too much power, then the barrier is very high. If they can be controlled, then the barrier goes down. Incidentally, to quote John Dewey again, John Dewey was not a particular radical. He was the leading social philosopher in the United States in the late 20th century throughout. His position was not only that, what you quoted, that democracy is the shadow cast by business over society. He also went on. He went on to say that this isn't going to change until you have democracy everywhere, meaning industrial democracy in the workplace, worker control of production, and popular control of every other institution. As long as you don't have that, policy will remain the shadow cast by concentrated power over society. So yeah, there should be, if you really want functioning democracy, it's got to go to institutional changes, significant ones.
Hier vorne und dann, ich habe Sie danach gesehen. Erst hier vorne Sie und dann Sie hinten.
Hello, my name is Ulios from radio station Funkhaus Europa. Dear Mr. Chomsky, I have two questions. You were speaking about the Arab Spring. How do you analyze the uprisings now? Masses of people in Spain and especially now in Greece go on the streets rejecting the party system and demanding direct democracy. And you were referring to the nuclear ambitions of Iran. How can you do that without mentioning the slaughtering of people in Iran from the regime there? People who are struggling for freedom in the last years.
In Iran?
For democracy.
In Iran?
In Iran, yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Spain and Greece. Quite important things are happening in Iran and Greece, but they're different. You got to look at these things in their particular circumstances. So in Greece, there's massive public protest against the austerity programs that are being imposed by the central authorities. And those are very destructive programs. Now, I think for all of Europe, my own feeling, I think what you need at a time of recession is not austerity, you need stimulus. In this case, I tend to agree with the Obama administration, though they do much too little of it. But in Greece, it's harming them very badly. I mean, they have real problems, but the programs that are being rammed down their throat by the European authorities are very likely going to destroy the economy. So people are protesting. But if you look closely, they don't seem to be protesting for anything. Not much, at least. It's hard to find any positive calls coming out. They're opposing what's happening, and they should be, but what do you do? Well, you know, there are a few options, not very many. Couldn't talk about them. In Spain, there's major protests, and there are programs. But if you look at the programs, they are sensible, but mildly reformist. So mildly reformist, they're needed. But even the press points out, Spanish press, well, these are feasible. Mostly they're calling for a political reform, like a change in the electoral system to allow more participation and so on. But those are things that could be instituted without the masters objecting much. So it's very important, and may go on beyond that, but right now it's a significant call for limited but essential reform. That's Iran and Greece, roughly. In the United States, Wisconsin, which was a big uprising, tens of thousands of people in the streets day after day, occupying the state capitol and so on. They went well beyond, and not just young people. They were calling for something else, namely defense of rights that are being destroyed. There's an effort by the right wing to eliminate the last limited residue of labor rights, collective bargaining. And there's a big popular uprising to protest that. You mentioned Iran. There's a very ugly regime, highly repressive, but unfortunately it's not unusual in the region. Like Saudi Arabia is worse. Nobody talks about Saudi Arabia because it's a Western client, so they can do whatever they like. There was an effort in Saudi Arabia to join the Arab Spring, have a day of rage, protests on Friday. The security presence was so extreme that people were afraid to go out in the streets. Nothing happened, and there's no protest in the West. The same in Kuwait. Loyal dictators are given the right to do anything they want. Disloyal ones, you got to do something about. Iran, nothing much that the West can do, so they scream about it but can't do anything. So sure, we ought to talk about it. We ought to try to help the protesters and try to protect them, but the means are quite limited. In contrast, the means are very great where the West has influence, substantial influence, as with the Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, elsewhere. So yes, you're right, but what would you suggest doing?
Sie hinten. Ja.
Hello?
Yeah.
What do you, please could you explain the meaning of nation building?
Of
Nation building.
nation building?
Yes.
It's just another fraud, you know. It's like, there are real cases. So the cases that are always presented in the literature are the success in nation building in Western Europe and Japan after the Second World War. But take a close look at what was done. First of all, these were societies that had already been functioning. Like if you go back to the 1920s, let's say, Germany was considered the most democratic society in the West. Also the peak of Western civilization in many ways, sciences, arts, and so on. Major industrial power. It was all in people's heads. So there was no real nation building in Germany. It was just allowing the local forces to act within limits. And it's important to understand the limits. There's good scholarship on this. I was quoting some of it. The primary effort in Germany and the rest of Europe was to restore the traditional order and to crush the anti-fascist resistance, which was largely labor-based. So they got to be crushed. Traditional order has to be restored. That started right away as the British and American forces were beginning to enter Europe. That started in Italy, remember, Sicily, then up through the Italian peninsula in 1943. One of their first tasks was to restore the fascist order and traditional business rule, and to destroy the resistance. And the resistance was pretty significant. The Italian partisans, they were holding down 6 Nazi divisions, and they had pretty much liberated the northern part of the country before the British and Americans got there. The British and Americans had to destroy the democratic system that had been developed by the left movements, left labor movements, and to restore the traditional order. I won't go through the details, but subversion in Italy goes right on until at least the 1970s. It's when the record runs dry, to try to prevent those forces from emerging. In Greece, it was the same. Britain tried to suppress the anti-Nazi resistance. They weren't powerful enough to do it. They called in the United States. In 47, 48, there was a major civil war in which maybe 150,000 people or so got killed. Torture, terror, so on, essentially restoring the traditional quasi-fascist order, driving out the partisan movement, the left, and so on. And it happened everywhere. Same in Japan, same in Korea. That was a post-war policy. So yes, there was a kind of nation building, but nation building in accord with grand area principles, not the pleasant mythology that people are taught in school. It can happen, but the other places where there have been economic and social successes, it's been over the objections of the West. There's pretty good scholarship on this, incidentally. The nation building is kind of like democracy promotion. It's another term used the same way. And there's very good scholarship on it. It doesn't penetrate the intellectual community, it doesn't reach the media and so on, but it's there. If you want to look into it, speaking of the United States, the very good source is the work of a man named Thomas Carruthers. He's a true believer. He was an official in the Reagan administration, insider, working on nation building, democracy promotion in mostly Latin America. But he's written about it all over the world. He was the head of the Law and Democracy project of the Carnegie Endowment, big prestigious institution, written several books right up to the couple of years ago. And he points out that he's a good scholar, an honest scholar. He believes in it, but he says that, he's speaking about the United States, same with everyone else. He said U.S. leaders are schizophrenic. They support democracy if and only if it accords with social and economic objectives. And he takes, say, the Reagan administration, which was full of talk of democracy promotion, and he was in it, he was working within it. He said they were sincere, but they, if you look at the progress of democracy, he said, in the Western Hemisphere, it did occur, but it occurred in the regions where the United States had least influence. So if you go down to the southern cone, the southern countries of the Western Hemisphere, there was progress in democracy. And as he pointed out, Reagan tried to prevent it and support the dictatorships he couldn't manage, so there was some democracy promotion. But if you come to the regions near the United States, where U.S. influence was overwhelming, he says essentially no moves towards democracy, and he gives the reason. The United States was willing to tolerate only top-down forms of democracy in which traditional ruling groups remain in control and remain subservient to the United States. Those are approximately his words. Well, he considers this a kind of like a pathology. So the leadership ought to be sent for psychoanalysis because they're schizophrenic. There's a much simpler explanation, plainly, but that one's ideologically unacceptable. And the same is true of nation building. So for democracy is fine for the West in Eastern Europe, great. So you hail what's called democracy. In fact, it's interesting to look at why they hailed it. You go back to the business press in 1990, they were very enthusiastic about the separation of the Eastern European satellites from Soviet control. The reasons were it would enable business leaders to undermine I'm quoting, the luxurious lifestyle of Western workers because there's a new labor force that's healthy, educated, blonde and blue-eyed. They didn't say that, but that's implicit. That can be exploited, very brutally exploited, and that'll undercut the Western labor movements. So it's terrific. Democracy in Eastern Europe is fantastic, but not democracy in the countries that we want to control, like not in the Middle East, for example, because it would be a disaster. As I said, just look at public opinion. So that's nation building and democracy promotion. It's very hard to find an exception.
Maybe there's space for one last short question, because we have an invitation then to a dinner with the rector, and I think we have to. And I think it's worthwhile, yeah. And yeah, who is here close to a microphone? No. Christoph, just give a microphone to somebody.
You're not Christoph?
Yeah. So,
in the German press we have periodic reminders that the European Monetary Union is on the brink of collapse on the one hand, because like our payments to Greece and Portugal and Ireland, of course always with xenophobic undertones, and on the other hand that the dollar is also very volatile. I'm not sure, I'm really skeptic about what these announcements have for a function, but do you believe that these currencies are really on the brink of collapse, and if that would happen, what effect would that have on the global order?
I don't think that the euro and the dollar and the yen are not on the brink of collapse. I mean, these are very rich societies with all the problems they're having. Historically speaking, it's pretty rich. It's not, they're suffering, but not at the style of the South. There are problems. Europe is rich enough to bail out the countries that are in trouble, but it's not at all clear that that's the right approach. I mean, why should Europe follow the recommendations of the central bank that say the solution to recession is austerity? That's been tried. I mean, that's Herbert Hoover in the United States. You know, yeah, his position was, we got a big depression, let's go to austerity. Well, you know what happened? Economy totally collapsed. And there's pretty good reason to suspect that that will happen again. If austerity is just not the right response to unemployment, the recession, what's the right response is essentially in a state capitalist system. I mean, there are more radical responses, but keeping to the institutions, the right response is probably Keynes's response, which worked. Stimulate, there's a shortage of demand, stimulate it, and that's got to come from the government. It could lead to a deficit, debt, and so on, but that can be overcome with growth. That's the way to overcome it. And furthermore, the main problem all over the Western world is not debt, it's unemployment. Unemployment is an extremely severe problem. For one thing, it's very harmful to the people, you know, so just on human grounds, the people, the families, the communities, they're suffering. But furthermore, even on just narrow economic grounds, unemployment means unused resources. There's working people who want to work. There are things that have to be done, but the system is so irrational, it can't put eager needed work into the hands of eager people. Well, that's a real social economic problem, and it's not solved by increasing austerity programs. If you look at the particular countries that you mentioned, they're all different. So Ireland, for example, actually had a surplus. Spain, too, had a surplus. In Ireland, the economic crisis came primarily because the government bailed out the banks. I mean, the banks destroyed the economy. They came to the public and say, okay, bail us out. And yeah, they did. There's another approach, and that is to say it's your problem. I mean, suppose anybody really believed in capitalism, nobody does. But if they did, if investors, let's say banks, make risky loans, a lot of profit, and then it crashes, it's the problem of the investors. It's not the problem of the community, if anybody believed in capitalism. So that's another approach they could have taken. Okay, you made the investments, you made the profits, now it's your problem. You take the losses. But the masters of mankind don't take the losses. They expect the public to bail them out. That's pretty much what's happening in Spain. Greece is a somewhat different problem. But I don't, it doesn't, you know, all of these things are debatable. It's not 2 + 2 = 4, but I think there's good reason to think that the programs that are being pursued are not well adapted to a situation of deep unemployment, unused resources, you know, human costs, and deficit, which is a problem that can be overcome with growth if demand is increased. The United States is an interesting case, actually. The United States kind of led the way in this, but if you look closely at the United States, the deficit, which is the big problem, it's the only issue discussed in Washington, is the deficit. Practically no discussion of the fact that unemployment is at depression levels for much of the population. What's the deficit? Well, this has been well analyzed. In the United States, about half the deficit comes from military spending. Military spending in the United States is out of sight. You know, it's about as much as the rest of the world combined. It doesn't provide security. In fact, it provides insecurity, but it's there for its own reasons, basically grand area reasons. In fact, I quoted Clinton as saying we have to keep forces forward deployed in Europe and Asia in order to ensure that people do what we want. Okay, not for the American population. So that's roughly half the deficit. The other half the deficit comes from the completely dysfunctional healthcare system. The U.S. healthcare system is an international scandal. It's about twice the per capita cost of other industrial countries and has some of the worst outcomes. And the reason's not hard to discover. It's the only privatized, unregulated system. And the private sector is extremely bad at providing public goods, like health. Highly inefficient, a lot of administrative costs, profits, bureaucracy, all kinds of things. So sure, it's extremely expensive. Drugs in the United States cost about twice as much as comparable countries. And the reason, again, is very straightforward. In the United States, and I think it's the only country in the world, at least that I know of, the government is not permitted by law to negotiate drug prices. They can negotiate anything else, but not drug prices. So big surprise, drug prices are out of sight. This is incidentally over the objections of about 85% of the population. There are ways to deal with this, which are not utopian. In fact, if the U.S. had the same kind of healthcare system as other industrial countries, not utopian, there would be no deficit. In fact, there would actually be a surplus. But you can't touch that because that's getting to the centers of power, the financial institutions, big pharmaceutical institutions. They won't allow it to be discussed since they basically run the government. You have a huge deficit. Well, you take a look at other countries, you can find ways of dealing with the deficit problem. It differs from country to country. And the big problem is lack of demand and lack of jobs. And I think that's even, so the system doesn't have to collapse. I mean, maybe it will if the wrong policies are followed, but it doesn't look likely.
Thank you very much.